We are so excited to have Shonda Guthrie here today. We are also so excited she has moved back to Alabama from Texas, so we'll be working with her a lot this year to do some professional development with our teachers. Shonda has devoted the last 21 years to the field of education. She has taught in the classroom, works as a private dyslexia therapist, provides private reading instructions to children and adults, works with parents of struggling readers, and provides professional development to teachers in the area of structured literacy. In addition to her master's in reading and writing, she's a certified academic language therapist, a licensed dyslexia therapist, a reading specialist, a certified dyslexia therapist through the International Dyslexia Association. She has a lot of wonderful information to share with us over the next hour. I look forward to hearing what all she has to share, and here she is.
Turn that on. There's a lot of you, so I'm gonna wear this, and hopefully we can keep everyone here okay. I need to turn it up. We can, but oh, it sounds like it's picking up more. Okay. Lisa read off kind of what my passions are and what I do for my profession, but I think it's noteworthy to identify and recognize Vestavia Hills, because in 2007 I moved to Alabama for the first time and left the classroom and started working with students privately for the first time full-time. I have always worked with students with dyslexia, but in 2007 started doing that full-time in Birmingham, and learned at that time that there were some dyslexia therapists out there, but no one had a licensure or a certification. So I began to work with Vestavia Hills, and Vestavia Hills is the first public school in the public school system in the state of Alabama to undertake the time, energy, and resources and devote those to training a group of teachers to become certified academic language therapists, which are considered the highest level of professional in working with students with dyslexia. So that was 10 years ago. In 2008 they started, 2008 or 2009 we started that. And then I was so excited to get the texts and the reminders and emails about the state of Alabama finally recognizing dyslexia in 2015. And I think that part of that was ushered in by this public school system saying, we have a need, we want it recognized. So I really, hats off to Vestavia Hills, and there's always been a piece of my heart here because of that. So my husband and my children and I have all moved back. We are living in Tuscaloosa, and I am married to an adult with dyslexia and have a 6th grade daughter who also has dyslexia. So it's near and dear to my heart as well. There are probably way more slides that will pop up here than we're going to be able to handle today in an hour. So if things go rapidly in front of you, it's probably because I'm going to flip through them and get to some information that I know that you'll want to know about. So these are the things that I really, really like to cover today, but some of those we're just going to have to popcorn, because this is probably what you're most interested in, this resources and effective strategies for students with dyslexia. But I think that it is vital for you to understand some of the pieces above that so that you know why these strategies and resources are so effective with students who have dyslexia. So before we do anything geared toward dyslexia, we really have to understand reading. So I'm going to take about 5 minutes and go over effective skilled reading, because I want you to see that in contrast with the way a dyslexic learner reads. Okay? So reading is basically taking those symbols on the page and producing a sound that matches with those symbols. But the brain also has to put meaning with those symbols. So there's a lot involved in skilled reading. And I like this definition or this formula for reading that was developed in 1986. It's still held as the most widely accepted simple view of reading by Goff and Tunmer, and it says this: reading comprehension is the result of any one person's decoding skills and their language skills, language comprehension, listening comprehension. So if either of those components is a 0, your reading comprehension will also be a 0. So this has been so instrumental in understanding why students with dyslexia have such a difficulty learning to read. This definition drives this picture, and I use this with teachers on a daily, weekly basis, because here's what we know. If we believe this definition of reading comprehension, then everyone in this room, every student in this building, every student in the world will fall into one of these 4 categories. You will either be skilled in both pieces that result in good reading comprehension, or one of those pieces will be impaired, or both will be impaired. Today, we're mainly focused on this profile of student. Your adequate language comprehension and your poor decoding skills. And that's the result of dyslexia. So not every child that falls in this quadrant, though, is dyslexic. I think that's really important for you to understand. Just because a child is a poor decoder does not mean that it is dyslexia. There's going to be some things that we're going to look at a little bit deeper, but this is a classic dyslexia profile. In fact, in this book, and if you've never read Overcoming Dyslexia and you're here because someone in your family has been diagnosed with dyslexia, or you think they are dyslexic, you need to read Sally Shawitz's book, Overcoming Dyslexia. I have it written as one of the resources. It's an excellent read. But she says this. She said, this profile is the classic profile of dyslexia, and here's how you know. The mother of a student with dyslexia says, and she quotes this in the book, "My child was so smart until they came to school." And I really felt that. It brings chills to me, because my daughter was the 3-year-old, the 4-year-old who said in the nursery at church on Sunday, that hurt my cartilage. Or we were camping and she would say, the sky looks ominous. And my husband looked at me and he said, I don't even know what that word means. And I know that I didn't use that word with her. So her vocabulary was off the charts. And I was prepared for the conversation with the principal. Your child is gifted. And we got to school and it all unraveled. Because when she began to see the symbols on the page, they did not make sense to her. So now, sitting in 6th grade, this child who once used the words ominous and cartilage way prior to really being exposed to those words is not sounding so smart anymore. Not because her vocabulary isn't good, but her peers have caught up with her vocabulary. So this is a classic dyslexic profile. Anyone identify with that type of learner, hopefully? Okay. So what's involved in skilled reading? This is what's involved. This is a picture example of what was on the formula. You have to be able to know the sounds involved when you see a word. So you have to know that that word says at. That's the decoding piece. But your brain also needs to give you a mental image so that you know what that word means. That's the comprehension piece. Okay, so that's what's involved in skilled reading. Now, I think it's important for us to understand our brains were never wired for reading. Our brains are wired for language through the spoken word. You do not have to teach a child to speak if they are in a good environment where language is present. That is not the case for reading. And I think we've missed the boat in education thinking that at some point all children will just start reading naturally. And that's been something that we've had to work through, because that's not the case. Now, research says about 60% of students will learn to read in spite of how they're taught. So 60% of children will learn to read just because they are exposed to print, they're around print, but 40% of children will not. And in even smaller percentage, around 20% of those students who are in that 40% bracket are going to need highly intense structured methods in order to learn to read effectively. Okay? Nyhouse Education Center in Houston, Texas, who I've done a lot of work with, developed this slide that helps us understand reading even more deeply and more precisely than the Goff and Tunber formula. But basically, here's what we learned from this. And we're looking at the left side of the screen because remember, these students that we're talking about, their impairment, their inadequacy is in the area of decoding. So we're looking at skilled reading involves being able to instantly recognize words. I'm going to put up a word and I don't want you to read it, okay? So I need your eyes up here, but I don't want you to read it. Okay, did you read it? I told you not to. Now, tell me, was that a word, the word that I put up on the screen, was that a word that you had as a sight word when you were in first, second, third grade? No. And if you tell me that you instantly read that word because you're exposed to that word so often, I don't believe that. I don't think you see that word that frequently. I think your brain has so automatized the sounds of our language that it's just almost impossible for you to see any word without knowing what that word is. That's skilled reading. Okay, so our students who have dyslexia have an impairment at the single word reading level. That instant word recognition is difficult for them. So if it's difficult for them to instantly recognize words, what's our layer of defense? What's our layer of intervention? It really starts at the sound symbol level. We need to be teaching explicitly, this letter says this sound. We cannot assume that our kids just instantly know this symbol stands for this sound. We also know that when we get into the older grades, and I'm going to use second grade and beyond as my older grades right now, if they are using the sounding out routine for every word, they're going to be in a bind. How many of you have older students? And I'm talking second grade up. Okay, so if they try to sound out this word, are they going to be in a little bit of a pickle when they try to get to the end of the sentence and understand what the sentence was about? Because here's what can happen. Most of our kids, if instant word recognition is not their strong suit, and they try to start sounding out this word, are they not going to say my? Okay? So sound symbol is going to run its course. It's always going to be running in the back of their mind, but we are going to have to move into teaching students with dyslexia the structure of the language. That means how to break words into syllables and attack big words, multisyllabic words. Because if they don't have that skill, when they get into second grade and beyond, it's going to kick them and they're going to be lethargic in their reading, and that disfluency, that slow, non-automatic reading is going to end up being what causes them to have impaired reading comprehension. So I want to skip to just current brain research. Now, you don't have all these slides. I really put in your handout the slides that are specific to effective strategies and resources. But here's what we know. Lots of money monies are being used to research brain development for the purpose of learning disabilities right now. And the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development has spent a lot of time and effort on this cause, as well as the International Dyslexia Association, the Yale Center for Dyslexia and Creativity, that's where Sally Shaywitz is, and the Haskins Lab on the East Coast does a lot of research. So any of those, if you're looking on the internet for dyslexia, you want to look at something that's related to these, not just any Google search on dyslexia. That can be very, very dangerous. So here's what Sally Shaywitz has said about dyslexia. Reading relies on those brain circuits that are already intact for language. So all these brain circuits that we already have that are set up for spoken language, reading is going to rely on them. And I'm going to try to make this simple, but I hope that that we can use this picture, and I want to make it simple, but I want you to see how complex reading is, because it's not complex for us anymore, and we forget how difficult it is for students who are learning to read. So these areas that are have arrows to them are all involved in reading. Reading happens on the left hemisphere of the brain. And so back to this picture that I showed earlier, this happens because there is a very fluid movement in the left hemisphere of the brain. So here's what happens in the left hemisphere, okay? If I see the word cat, and I recognize it as a whole word, I don't have to sound it out, then that word comes into the left hemisphere of the brain, the temporal lobe. It's shot to the back of the occipital cortex, which carries the visual stimulation. It shoots it to the angular gyrus, which says, okay, you have a memory that to attach to this word. That memory is this furry little fuzzy guy with claws. He may have clawed you before. You got this memory, and then the word is sent up here to Broca's area that is responsible for speaking that word. So it's this beautiful chain from here back here. It's just seamless. That is a skilled reader's pathway in the brain. Now, just in the last few decades, we've been able to see skilled reading in contrast with dyslexic reading through through fMRI, functional MRI. So we want to look at this. This is a skilled reader. And you see the pathway, it's bright, it's colorful. We don't see that same activity in a dyslexic reader. Okay, now it would be awesome if you could go to the doctor and say, can you put my child under an fMRI and just tell me if he's dyslexic? Okay, but that's not really the way it works. In fact, these images happen over thousands of brains being imaged and mapped on top of one another. But what's important for you to understand is that a dyslexic reader does not have the imaging on the left hemisphere. It's almost all in the right hemisphere, which is not a good pathway for reading. So it ends up being very inefficient. And look at the one place that it's highlighted. It's in the area that is responsible for speech and language. So if you're listening to a young dyslexic reader, you hear a lot of sounding out, and you hear them doing it audibly. So, and they try to put it together. You're hearing that. And that is typical of a young dyslexic reader. So, we'll skip through those quickly. So I just want you to understand that the pathway involved in skilled reading is very seamless. The pathway involved in a dyslexic reader prior to treatment or therapy is not as skilled, not as seamless, not as smooth. In fact, what you'll see is it getting hung up here in the Broca's area. So one more thing on just reading development. Our government in 1997 commissioned a national reading panel. and they put forth this, this effort to find out the best way to teach reading. And in 2000, a report was delivered that was after a meta-analysis of about 15,000 different reading research studies. And what they found was that there are some very important pillars in good, effective reading instruction. This had nothing to do with learning disabled students, nothing to do with dyslexia, but here's what they came up with. They identified 5 components of effective reading instruction for all classrooms in the early grades. They said every classroom needs to have phonemic awareness instruction, phonics instruction, fluency instruction, vocabulary instruction, and comprehension instruction. So they identified that now our schools, public, private, charter, homeschool, any person that is teaching reading, in order for it to be comprehensive, it needs to have these 5 components. My favorite resource, and I know I'm a kind of a junkie on this, but I really love this resource. If you want to write it down, it's www.literacyhow.com. literacyhow.com. And this is coming out of the Haskins Lab, which I mentioned earlier. But what I love about this, and I don't have live links because I'm not on the internet, but if you go to Literacy How, it has all 5 of those essential pillars of instruction. I can take my cursor and tap on any one that maybe I'm not familiar with that term, I don't know what that means. She's going to explain it in layman's terms, and then has listed tons of articles, tons of activities and strategies related to each of those 5 pillars. So I really think that this is a great resource, especially for us in education, but I think you will get a lot out of it if you visit her website. So what are some stumbling blocks to effective reading? Well, being able to read accurately and fluently. That's the biggest stumbling block that we see with students with dyslexia is that they are not able to read accurately or fluently. And so that comprehension piece, there's no working memory available for the comprehension. They're so tired from trying to sound everything out or figure it out that they don't have any energy left to think about maybe how that character looks or what's happening on the side. They don't have any energy for that. Insufficient vocabulary, general knowledge, reasoning that would support comprehension. And then lastly, the absence of motivation. And if you're dealing with a child in 4th grade and above, that's where we see this piece really kick in. Reading has become so difficult that they have lost their excitement and love for the process of reading. Now, if I were choosing the 2 that are the most typical of a student with dyslexia, I would say it's the 1st and the 3rd. Now, I do think it's important for you to understand that as they get older, that vocabulary may become impaired because they're not reading as much. And so you see them not comprehending what words mean because it's not something they've seen before, which is my plug for you as parents to read aloud to your students no matter how old they are, because you are able to read text 4 grade levels above them and they can comprehend. They don't comprehend text that they're trying to read 4 grade levels above because they're working so hard at trying to handle the words. So please continue to read to your students. Now, I'm not going to spend much time here. I mean, I've got a lot on this slide, but we're just going to hit it. How long do you think the term dyslexia has been around? What do you think?
40 years.
40 years? Okay. All right, well, actually, the first time it was used was in 1887. And it was a German ophthalmologist by the name of Dr. Berlin, and he used the term dyslexia because prior to that, what they were doing was treating adults who were unable to read, but they previously had the ability to read. They had just had a stroke or a brain injury, and now they were unable to read. And so they were studying what is happening in the brain for this adult who was able to read, and now they are not able to read. Why? What is that? How is that linking to the brain? Now I'm going to skip forward because I think it's important that we understand that as early as 1917, James Hinchelwood began working with young kids who were experiencing the same exact symptoms of what they saw in these adults who were unable to read after an injury or a brain injury or a stroke. And this was the first time that people started saying, there's something to this, that they're coming out from birth. They have this word blindness is what they started calling it, congenital word blindness. If you've been looking up dyslexia, you probably should have seen the name Samuel Orton. Dr. Orton was actually a psychiatrist who is known as the father of dyslexia. Interestingly, he did not use the word dyslexia. He used the word strephosymbolia, and he was using that word to illustrate twisted symbols. Now, there's some good and some bad that came out of that, but one awesome thing that came out of Dr. Samuel Orton's research and his practice was that he took a young man who was highly intelligent but had trouble learning to read. And he was the first person that said, you know what, this has nothing to do with intelligence. And so we can thank Dr. Orton because he was the one that understood that the typical dyslexic learner is highly intelligent. They just have trouble reading. He began using Grace Bernald's method with this student, or with this patient in a psychiatric ward actually, and saw that a multisensory approach was what was making the most impact. So thankfully we have Anna Gillingham enters in the 1930s. She was a teacher. And she was also a psychologist, and she began to work with the research of Dr. Orton, but the practice of teaching, and she developed a system that we use today, and that's what's called the Orton-Gillingham approach. It's the most recognized approach with a student that has dyslexia. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about facts and myths of dyslexia. This might surprise some of you, but you may already know some of these facts. One thing that we need to understand is that dyslexia is not a visual impairment or a visual learning disability. Now, do students with dyslexia have trouble with visual images that are characterized by letters? Yes. But this is really neat because in 1985, 86, Valentino had done a study that talked about this is a myth about students seeing things backwards. He took the Hebrew alphabet and he asked students to copy the Hebrew alphabet, and he found that dyslexic students did no better or poorer than average students, that none of the students were familiar with the Hebrew letters. So we realize that it's not a symbol flipping disorder. Now, I'm going to hold something up and I want to know, what is this? Okay, what is it now? Okay, what is it now? Okay, so most things in our language, no matter how they're turned or stood, carry the same meaning and the same name. not our alphabet. So you have this symbol, and it's a B, and that says B. But if you turn it, now it's a D, and it says D. And if you turn it, it's a P, and it says P. And if you turn it again, it's a Q, and with the letter U, it says Q. So it's not that students are seeing things backwards. It's that these symbols are not holding a shape and meaning as easy as something else in the language. All right? Now, do they make reversals? Yes, but guess what? All young students make letter reversals. It's pretty common through the second grade. In working with adults with dyslexia, I have not seen many adults making reversal errors. Do students make reversal errors? Yes, but all students do. Do students with dyslexia make more errors? Probably so, but it doesn't have to do with the eyesight. It has to do with the shape not taking secure meaning. It's not anchored in very well. Okay? So, I think that it's really important for us to understand that dyslexic readers have to be taught these patterns, because these are the two areas that a dyslexic reader has an impairment in that sets them apart from a skilled reader. So they have difficulty with hearing, the hearing patterns in the language, the rhyming, the syllables, hearing syllables, and the orthographic patterns. Let me ask you this question. We may not be able to share out, but think about your child, if they have dyslexia, or you think they might have dyslexia, and you've ever played a rhyming game with them. Did it go well? No. I will never forget rhyming with Lucy, and I would say, Jack and Jill went up the, and she might put in mountain, road, and I knew enough to understand that wasn't okay. But for a parent that's not an educator, they might think, oh, she comprehends what she's doing, but the task was rhyming based. There's a lot involved in rhyming, and students with dyslexia, because their impairment is in the phonological area of the brain, they are not able to catch on to those patterns as well as our skilled readers. They also are not able to do a task that we put great value on, and that is segmenting phonemes. Phonemes are a fancy word for sound. So if you were to say to your child, what word or what are all the sounds you hear when I say bat? And they tell you at. They're not hearing every single sound in isolation, because every sound would be at. So if they're not able to segment sounds well, that's an indicator. It's a red flag. It doesn't mean they have dyslexia. They may never have done that task before. But you want to be concerned or aware of a student in first grade who's not able to hear all the sounds. That will directly affect their ability to spell. Because if I can't hear all the sounds, I probably won't be writing all the letters needed for those sounds. Have you ever seen a child maybe spell the word blend, B-E-D, because they're not hearing all the sounds? One thing that I do with young students is I'll just give them counters, and I'll say a word like stand, okay, and we'll say all the individual sounds, and they'll move a counter. St, and things like that, okay? And then, of course, the other part that is impaired is the orthographic patterns, the writing patterns. We see dyslexia show up in spelling all the time. Now, that doesn't mean that they're failing spelling tests, because guess what they're doing for spelling tests? They're memorizing those words. But on Friday, they made a great grade, but then on Saturday or Monday, can they spell the same word? Probably not. So these are the two areas we most see dyslexia show up in. The Matthew effect is really good for us to understand, and then we'll move on. I want you to see that a child who comes into school with great phonemic awareness, they've been rhyming, they've been able to clap syllables, they've been able to hear individual sounds in a word. Those are the children who are really ready to decode. And remember, decoding is a piece of that formula. So they're ready to decode. They're so excited about getting the first book. And they see that book, and they decode it well, and so they begin to enjoy reading. And the more they read, the more fluent they become, and all of these pieces that go along with skilled reading, their world knowledge increases, their oral language increases. All of this just gets better and better and better. The Matthew effect alludes to the fact that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. So a child who does not have good phonemic awareness, are they really ready to decode those books that the teacher hands them? So the teacher hands them a book, it doesn't come easy, so the next time the teacher hands them a book, they don't really want it. And so they're not reading as easily, they're not gaining the fluency, and so their world knowledge, their oral language, their vocabulary maybe doesn't decrease, but it sure looks different in relation to their peers. Okay? All right. So I said we were going to skip some slides, so I want you to just look at these words. I know that these are nonsense words, they're pseudo words, but do you have the system to decode these words even if they're not real? What would the first word be? Zoid. How did you know what to say when you saw those letter patterns? Did someone along the lines teach you that Z says Z? And how did you know to say oi when you got to that OI? Someone taught you that vowel pair or that diphthong or that letter pattern, whatever you call it. Someone taught you that along the way, okay? Now look at that last word. You having a little bit more trouble reading that last word? Okay, because we know that in the English language, every word has to have a vowel. So without a vowel, really this makes no sense. That last word is no more difficult to a dyslexic reader than the rest of these. Because remember that it's those sound patterns, those letter patterns, that are difficult for them to pick up. That's why we have to spend more time teaching them, students with dyslexia, letter patterns. Now let's look at these words. These words are more like the words in the older grades, second grade and up. So look at that first word. How would you read that? Okay, herflisky? Is it herflicksky? Okay, now, why did you say E for that Y and not I? Say it again? It's at the end, but sometimes Y at the end of a word does say I, but not usually when it's in a long word. So see, you have a lot of systems in place that you may not have said or had to put words to in the last several years, but you know how the language is made up. Our students with dyslexia have a much more difficult time with those patterns. In addition to the weak phonological skills that we talked about and the weak orthographic skills, sometimes our students have difficulty with rapid naming or that fluency piece. So we work with students with dyslexia even as early as pre-K and kindergarten, rapidly naming letters or rapidly naming high-frequency words or rapidly naming decodable words or even phrases, because we need that automaticity to build. We need them to be able to speak those words quickly and fluently. You might even work with a young child on naming colors this way, because sometimes they aren't even able to pull out those color names quickly. That has to do with that rapid naming, that retrieval. So now we're going to look over at the definition of dyslexia. And if you have looked and Googled dyslexia, you've probably seen this definition. So IDA adopted this definition in 2002. It says dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin. It is characterized by difficulty with accurate and fluent word recognition, and by poor spelling and decoding skills. So now does that definition make sense to you in light of what we've talked about in the previous slides? That definition is daunting so many times to parents who are looking it up for the first time. But when you see what creates skilled reading, now it doesn't look daunting, because it really just highlights the things that you notice in your students that are difficult. It also goes on to say these difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language, which is those sound components, rhyming, syllables. And it's often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities, meaning they're smart. They're so smart. So it just seems odd that they have this inability to read. And given that they have had effective classroom instruction. And we know that's taking place in your school system. Astavia Hills has always been known for good, quality, effective instruction in the classroom. Secondary consequences, so other things that are going to come as a result, may be problems in reading comprehension. Could you explain now why? Because if the decoding is not there, when they try to read, they just can't allow for the energy for the comprehension. And reduced reading experience. That makes sense, because they're not reading as frequently and often, and that's going to impede the growth of vocabulary and their background knowledge. All makes sense now as we've looked at these pieces of dyslexia. So, I want you to know, I love this picture of this bridge, because it's the slow and inaccurate reading, decoding, that best predict difficulties in reading comprehension. So those of you who raised your hand that have older students, their dyslexia is probably not at the sounding out level any longer, but you're seeing the manifestation in they read a passage, they read a paragraph, and they just can't tell you what it says. And now you see that it's that word reading effort that is probably taking up all of their energy to be able to comprehend. So this is, I really, again, this came out of the Haskins lab, but I think it's so important for us to understand that the bridge between decoding and comprehension is fluency. So if you have a teacher who's working on fluency with your child, that's a good thing, because we want them to become more fluid in their reading so that they can understand what they read as the passages get longer. All right, so we see this as the definition of dyslexia, and so we need to understand that it is a language disability, but it's not a language learning disability that falls in a clump. It really is specific. Language learning disabilities deal with all aspects of language. Your children, your students who have dyslexia really don't struggle with all areas of language. It's more specific to the phonological area of language and the areas that go along with spelling, phonological, and phonics. So how can we help? The International Dyslexia Association says for a child who has dyslexia, it's very important that they receive structured language, multisensory structured language education, which includes phonology, the sound symbol associations, which is phonics, syllable instruction, which is what allowed you to read Fluency, morphology, which is the study of prefixes, suffixes, roots, syntax, which is grammar or understanding the placement of words in sentences, semantics, which is understanding the meaning of words, and all of those together are a multi-sensory structured language education program. And it's really important for us to know this. The research coming out of the Florida Center for Reading Instruction says it's not as important which program you choose. It's more important that the program follows the guidelines well. So there are a lot of programs out there. You know, of course, I'm going to be probably a little bit biased toward the one that I was trained in. But many programs are out there that include all of these components. So it's important that you don't fight for one specific program as much as you fight for a program that encompasses the important pieces. Okay? So the International Dyslexia Association has started using the term structured literacy, and they've given a lot of information about what structured literacy is. In your notes somewhere, I've listed the knowledge and practice standards for teaching reading. This has become a passion of mine because I was not trained well in college. My mother was one of my professors. I was not trained to teach children how to read that fell in that 40% bracket of students who need extra instruction. And so I really think it starts with our higher education and our colleges. And so we are hoping, we are really pushing from the International Dyslexia Association that colleges will adhere to these knowledge and practice standards for teaching reading. So you can look those up and see if how much of that relates to what your children are receiving right now. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead really quickly and look at what constitutes highly trained professionals. All right, so schools can provide students with a professional who has received professional development in an accredited multi-sensory structured language education program. They do not have to by the law, but that is something that actually Vestavia Hills has. We have several teachers who have been trained and have that certification. Now, this is coming from your Alabama Resource Guide, but they also say that if a highly trained professional from an accredited MSLE program is not available, a dyslexia specialist, a reading specialist, a learning specialist can also administer those components of effective reading instruction. A licensed dyslexia therapist or a licensed dyslexia practitioner are all listed in that code. Now, you may have asked one or more of these questions before. Are there more girls or boys with dyslexia? Will students with dyslexia outgrow it? These are common questions, and they absolutely are important to answer. But I think that we don't want to get hung up on these. We really want to get hung up on getting them the right treatment. There are probably more boys identified because, speaking from a classroom teacher, when they are struggling with reading, they show out. My daughter, struggling with reading, she's just going to slink back, head down. In fact, in second grade, her teacher told me for the first 6 months of the school year, she's great. She's good. I don't know what you're worried about. And then the call came in January. And I said, how did you pick it up now? Well, I read with her. Oh, yeah, you decided to read with her. Well, that's great. But she just would pull back. So it's not that our boys probably have dyslexia more often. It's that they respond differently. Students will not outgrow dyslexia. The brain will not rewire itself in that way. I know that word has been thrown out, rewiring. She even uses it in Overcoming Dyslexia. But what she's talking about is teaching the brain the correct pathway to use. But students with dyslexia can become highly educated and functioning adults. In fact, probably the most money in the world is made by dyslexic learners because they are front-brained. I tell my kids all the time, listen, I can teach you to use the part of the brain needed for skilled reading, but no one can teach a child how to use this portion of their brain. You just can't teach it. So when you get taught to read the highly effective way of reading pathway in your brain, you have double the way. I mean, you've got this double brain thinking path that you are going to do great things with. Highly capable, highly qualified, very wealthy adults think with the front of their brain. So we want to encourage them and help them see it as a positive. The percentage of students that struggle with dyslexia, numbers vary, but really the most common number now is about 20% of students. Is dyslexia genetic? Yes. Yes. In fact, that's why I literally was waiting for which one of my babies was going to have it, because I knew from being married to a dyslexic man, I just waited. And sure enough, it was my firstborn. And so the likelihood of her having a child with dyslexia is high. And is ADHD common in students with dyslexia? They call it a comorbidity. It can. You probably see boys act almost like they have ADHD when they're unable to read well. And so sometimes we think it is ADHD, but some children will have both. Some children have one or the other. So now I want to just quickly go through the provisions of the law. And I want you to understand that this is really important for you to know what you have as provisions, but understand it well before you go fighting a fire with this behind you. Here's what we know. There are three provisions in the law or code, but only one receives federal funding. So this is really important for you to understand. 504 is really what we know as the Americans with Disabilities Act. It has no funding associated with it in schools. IDEA, the special education law, does have funding. And even though Alabama is recognizing dyslexia now, since 2015, they've offered a code, but they have not offered a law. Unlike Texas, we have a Texas dyslexia law. It's a little bit more heavy, but still no funding goes with it. So when the state doesn't give funding, it limits what schools can offer sometimes. So quickly, IDEA, the special education law, was passed in 1975. It was revised in 1995, and then again in 2004. There are 13 ways to qualify for special education, and one way is under this specific learning disability, which dyslexia is listed. In order to qualify for a long time, there had to be a referral and a psychometric evaluation, and at one time there had to be a discrepancy. There had to be a 16-point discrepancy between their performance and their IQ. Now, because of RTI, we had a little bit more lenience there, but still I want you to understand, based on what you've seen in the previous slides, is special education always the best option for a student with dyslexia? I would argue that not always is special education the route I want to go through for my student with dyslexia, because not all special education educators have a system by which to cover all of those components that we want to see in a multi-sensory structured language education. So I always caution parents, don't fight for special education before you look at some of the other options. Of course, you know that the ARD, the Admission Review and Dismissal Committee, has to meet and determine what is best for that child, and an individualized education plan is created for them. So that happens under the special education law. There is funding. There are a lot of rights you have as a parent and a lot of rights that a student has under this law. Okay? If you are going to go this route, I really recommend that you have someone outside of your family with you, because as you begin to advocate for your child and talk through some of these issues, this is very personal to you. And sometimes we can't hear things as clearly because it is hard to talk about our children struggling. So you might want to have someone with you that has more of an objective set of ears. The other thing that we have is 504. After your child graduates from high school, special ed law does not cover them any longer. So you want to think about what are they going to do in college? What are they going to do outside of college? So this 504 plan, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, really happened because we had a lot of Vietnam vets coming home. And we decided, you know what? They need larger parking spaces for wheelchairs. They might need automated doors when they go into a place of business. But just like that, saying we cannot keep you from accessing our property or our business, same goes with learning. We cannot keep you from accessing learning. So this is where we have accommodations. Oftentimes, we'll say, we have, need quiet space for you to take a test, or longer time for you to take a test. So accommodations are allowed under IDEA. Now, we are not going to spend a lot of time here, but just want you to understand that this state guidance or state legislation in Texas is meant to really cover students no matter what they're under, whether they are in general education, 504, or special education. Really, we're hoping to give them a code, some guidance, no matter what they're being served under. So your state of Alabama has made a resolution. Let's see. And that resolution occurred in 2015. And the nice thing about the resolution is that it's using a lot of language from the Texas Code. So I really put Alabama into Texas when it said that these are the things that really need to happen in dyslexia instruction. Do those look familiar? Have you seen those in previous slides? So your state is moving in the right direction. And it is a good thing that we have recognized that dyslexia needs a different way of learning, a more intense way of learning. So I know that many of your students may be receiving dyslexia services in the school, but if you are considering finding a private therapist for more instruction outside of the school, which some of our students need, I just really want to caution you that you want to look for what the IDA says is a highly trained professional private therapist. Do not just jump onto a scheme where a person says, I can cure them of dyslexia. Dyslexia is not curable. Okay, so we don't want to find a therapist who's offering a quick 3-week fix or a quick 6-week fix. It just doesn't happen that way. You also want to be leery of any therapist that is focusing solely on hand-eye coordination type of activities. Colored overlays. If that's exclusive of what they're offering, you want to be leery of that. You want to be, that's why the visual training with the colored overlays. You want to be leery of any therapist that's just focusing on tactile, making letters out of Play-Doh exclusively. And then you want to be leery of any tutoring that is infrequent. Maybe the therapist says, I'll see them once a week, or I'll see them once a month. Because that really takes on more of like homework workload, just a more of a tutoring type of atmosphere instead of therapy. So, IDA recommends that a student with dyslexia is seen 180 minutes a week. And that's because there's so much to cover with them. Now, I don't think your state is requiring that, but if you're looking for a therapist, you're looking for some of those requirements. So I do want to show you this. I think I've got a couple slides and I'm going to let you go, but I do want you to see the way that Sally Shaywitz illustrates this idea of sea of strengths and island of competency. Your students with dyslexia have so many strengths. They have many more strengths than they do weaknesses. It just happens to be that their island in the middle, their weakness, is decoding, which relates to all of these areas when it comes to reading. And so when they're in the older grades and they're not able to decode as effortlessly, all of these other strengths seem to get bogged down, and they seem to be weak in all of these areas. But I do think it is important for you to understand that these are actual very capable students whose decoding struggle is now impeding these other areas. In your notes, or in your handout, you have some resources. I have drawn a red line because the red line really separates resources for students under the age of middle school and then older students. Make sure you look through those. There might be some resources there. You also have a list of things that you can be doing at home with your students to help with the phonological aspect, the spelling aspect. I did want to model this if anyone is working on spelling at home. This is in your notes. But remember that the two pieces that are so hard for our students are hearing all the sounds and knowing the correct letters to write for those sounds. So this is a strategy. It's written in your notes that I'd love for you to try. You call out the word. So stand. You have your child echo that word. Okay? Have your child say every sound in that word. And by doing that, you will hear if they're not able to hear all the sounds. Immediately after that, have them name the letters that they need for each of those sounds. You again will see if they have the wrong letter attachment. So that's an activity to use for practice at home. Memorizing or writing words 15 times each is not going to come about the result that you're hoping. You really want to train them in spelling. You also may want to look up this website. This is a downloadable rapid word generator that you can plug in words that they're struggling with in school. And notice that you'll see the same words on every row, just in a different order. So you would work on 6 words at a time. And I have the instructions there for you so that you can work on rapid word recognition with your child. That would be an awesome thing to do with them at home. May I suggest that you make a prefix and suffix deck. This would be an awesome thing to use as you wait at the orthodontist or the allergy shots. This is Lucy's. So you see that on the front, she's going to plug in any prefix, suffix, root she's learned. So here, scope. And down at the bottom, I don't want you to put the meaning because that's what we want them to memorize. So a word with scope. So subway, and she can quiz herself. Scope to see, and then she turns it over, and the meaning would be on the back of the card. You aren't needed for this except in the making of it, but they can practice these morphemes, prefixes, suffixes, roots that they're learning, because these will help them become really quick at recognizing those bigger words in science and in math and social studies. That would be a strategy I would recommend. The last thing I want to show you is something that I'm using every single day at my home right now. Not because it's really dyslexia related, but because the workload is so daunting for our students with dyslexia, okay? This has nothing to do with really dyslexia, but it helps them manage things. So I'll set this clock. You know, a lot of us use timers with kids. The problem with timers is that they can't see how much time they've wasted. They only see what's left. And if you have dyslexia, you think you can conquer the world and eat some cereal in 1 minute, okay? So, here's what I do. I start from the hour hand, or actually let's start with the minute hand, and I'll say how long do we want to work on this before we take a break. Let's work 15 minutes. So I'll use the minute hand and draw straight out, and then I'll count 5, 10, 15, and I'll fill this in, okay? At the end of that, we're going to get to take a break, but what they're going to be able to see is how much time they have used up and how much time is left in real time on the clock. And if you find a clock that's glass, then it's just as easy as wiping off. This has been a really great tool to use at home. The other thing that I want to show you that's easy to do, but it is highly powerful, is using a calendar with your kids. Here's what I did last week. Okay, this is real life for my home right now. Okay, now take off football and put in softball is really what is going on in our house. These are things that are going to happen outside of school. She's got to practice her guitar. She's got to go to softball. I've got football on here to relate. Please forgive me. But all of these things are real world. They're going to happen. Now, if I have a science project that's due on Wednesday, okay, I'm going to probably put that, or on Thursday. Now, I'm going to need to do a math packet on Monday and a math packet on Wednesday. My English essay's due on Tuesday, and I begin putting these sticky notes where I think I want them, okay? But here's what happens. If I am a child who procrastinates and I think, you know what, I didn't get my science research done on the weekend, I'll just move that sticky note over, and then that sticky note moves over, and what they begin to see is they've got 16 sticky notes on one day, and no one can accomplish all of those things in one day. So this sticky note movement of the sticky notes and on a planner has really become a great strategy for us at home to manage the workload and see it all laid out. So I would encourage you to use this. There is a page of resources for you as a parent, and also I've listed some books that I've really enjoyed reading that deal with dyslexia or learning disabilities. So I know that we flew through that, and I hope that you were able to hold on to something from all that. The resource directory that many of you received that was outside, I brought with me from Texas. So the advertisements and things are not going to be applicable to you. The real reason I wanted you to have it was there is an article in there on dysgraphia, which not a lot of information is out there about that. So there's an article about that, article about the importance of handwriting, and then also common characteristics of dyslexia and related disorders that I thought you might benefit from looking at.